Dear Lady Christiane Dahrendorf, dear colleagues, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's a really great pleasure to be here at this fantastic gathering of the Dahrendorf clans, I would say, with so many institutions and individual people who are so closely associated with Ralf Dahrendorf. He'd have been delighted. For much of his life, Ralf Dahrendorf had on his writing desk, or to be accurate, one of his writing desks, because characteristically Ralf had several writing desks, a little ceramic fragment, white and blue ceramic fragment, which he had picked up in a little town called Świecko in Poland in 1973. And this was a fragment from the Gestapo prison camp in which, as a 15-year-old, he had been imprisoned for starting something rather ambitiously called the Freedom Association of High School Students, including 10 days in solitary confinement and a Christmas 1944, spent in the camp. And Ralf always said that he could date his passion for freedom from that experience of radical unfreedom, in particular from the 10 days of solitary confinement, from the weeks in the Gestapo camp, more broadly from the experience of unfreedom in Nazi Germany, and then let's remember the Soviet seizure of power in what was then still the Soviet zone of occupation, which was the reason his father and the family had to flee to Hamburg at short notice. So the thing most characteristic for Ralf was this absolutely unshaken and unshakable, consistent passion for freedom, this love of liberty. And that was absolutely solid in him all the way through his life. We're going to talk about the intellectual legacy, the living with complexity, the sophistication. But the thing I want to mention first is just this elemental love of liberty. And whatever happened anywhere in the world, one could be sure of the basic angle from which Ralf would approach it, which was the angle of individual liberty. If he were alive today, I'm sure we'd be talking about Hong Kong. And maybe, if we're talking about the crisis of liberalism today, that's one thing we have to get back, is that elemental commitment to individual liberty. Now, of course, liberalism in its many forms is something much more complicated than simply the love of liberty, although there is no serious version of liberty that does not have individual liberty near its core. Liberalism is, as Judith Sklar put it, a tradition of traditions, multiple traditions. It has to be described in clusters of associated ideas, so that, for example, John Gray argues that characteristic for liberalism are 4 dimensions: individualism, universalism, egalitarianism, and meliorism. Now, I'm not going to explore that in greater detail. I'm going to assume that we all accept that there is today, in some meaningful sense, a crisis of liberalism, however precisely defined. Ralf Dahrendorf, of course, only experienced the very beginning of this crisis. In fact, in a sense, and one will be careful how one said this, but in a sense the good fortune of his biography was that, being born in 1929, the last 20 years of his life were years which could plausibly be seen as the greatest triumph of liberty and of liberalism. He always said that 1989 was the best year of his life politically. He celebrated it with us at St. Anthony's, his 60th birthday in 1989. He died, of course, in 2009 at the very beginning of what we can now see as a multidimensional crisis of liberalism. The symposium that we did at Oxford for his 80th birthday, in which Jürgen Habermas and Fritz Stern, amongst others, paid tribute to Ralf, in those last months of his life, was actually an occasion to start trying to understand the causes of that crisis of liberalism. We did a little publication out of it entitled On Liberty, the Dahrendorf Questions, and it's online, and if you look at it, you can see just the beginnings of the kinds of answers that Ralf was wanting to give. But what I don't want to do is to be a ventriloquist for Ralf Dahrendorf, because it is strictly illegitimate to take dead thinkers and say what Orwell would have said, or what Aron would have said, or what Dahrendorf would have said to the crisis today. What I'm going to do in the next 25 minutes is to give you my own reflections on the causes of the crisis of liberalism and what we as liberals in the broadest sense should do about it. Informed by Dahrendorf thinking, touching on some of the subjects of this colloquium, but not ventriloquizing. What I'm going to offer you is not going to be systematic, it's certainly not comprehensive, and it's certainly not value-free. So first of all, to the causes. Now, as many of you will know, there's already a small library of books on the crisis of liberalism, published in just the last 3 or 4 years. Much of this debate is framed in terms of failures or mistakes of liberals and liberalism. And I think that framing is too narrow. I want to start by suggesting to you that the problems that liberalism faces today are of different kinds. I'm going to talk briefly about what I call problems of inheritance, problems of success, problems of anticipation, and only then of problems of misjudgment. So first of all, problems of inheritance. And here I'm thinking about particularly post-communist Europe, Central Europe, for which Ralf wrote his reflections on the revolution in Europe. You have a session coming up on the problems of Eastern Europe. Is there any liberal Sonderweg? And there's an almost cliched version of this argument about the rise of illiberalism in countries like Hungary and Poland, which interprets it as a reversion to pre-1939 authoritarian traditions in these countries, to pre-Second World War political culture. Now, I think there are elements of truth in that. If you look at the Law and Justice Party in Poland, you can see elements of the pre-war endetia. Certainly, if you look at Orban in Hungary, you can see elements of Horthyism. But I think the case is vastly overstated. And for example, it doesn't apply at all to the Czech Republic, where, of course, if the Czechs look back before 1939, as they do repeatedly to this day, they find Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk and not Horthy or Pilsudski. I think the key lies in the legacy of 40 years of communism and the character of the transition. So this is what we have there, so to speak, populism with post-communist characteristics. So profound and destructive was the impact of 40 years of communism. So much had it destroyed, not only in democratic institutions, but in independent legal institutions and in the civil society that mattered so much to Dahrendorf. And, of course, the abolition of private property and the property rights that went with it. Remember that Karl Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto define the essence of communism in one sentence, the abolition of private property. That the challenge we faced after 1989 was an enormous one. It was summed up in the joke at the time, we know you can turn an aquarium into fish soup, but can you turn fish soup back into an aquarium? And it was a huge challenge. And if we see that independent democratic institutions are weak in response to the populist onslaught, that independent courts are weak in response to the populist onslaught, or indeed civil society turns out to be rather fragile in response to that assault, particularly civil society in the sense of the word that Ralf preferred to use in German, namely Bürgergesellschaft. That's to say, a civil society built on a genuinely independent bourgeoisie, or Bürgertum. That is, for the most part, because these institutions and structures are young and fragile. You don't have to reach back to the early political culture to explain the fragility of these institutions. And then, of course, the huge challenge of privatization, of taking a situation where private property had virtually been abolished and reconstructed a market economy and property rights, inevitably resulted in major problems in the process of the largest privatization in modern European history, larger by far than anything Margaret Thatcher attempted. And so a lot of the problems that we see in East Central Europe today, in my view, have their roots in the problems of inheritance, the difficulty of overcoming that legacy. So, for example, we always talk about the problem of inequality, often ascribed to quote-unquote neoliberalism, a term I want to come back to. But the peculiar character of inequality in post-communist Central Europe is that it is an inequality which has economically privileged former members of the communist ruling class, the nomenklatura and the secret police, so that the poor and now unemployed or retired shipyard worker in Gdańsk, who fought for Solidarność in 1980 and through the hard years of the 1980s and is now still living in a small flat, sees not just that other people have got rich, but that it's General Jaruzelski's spokesman, Jerzy Orban, who is now living in a wonderful villa and throwing extravagant parties. So in addition to the problem of inequality, there is the sense of historical injustice that comes from the results of a corrupt and over-rapid privatization, which comes on top of what Ernest Gellner wonderfully called the price of velvet. Namely, that if you have a velvet revolution, that is to say a negotiated transition, you cannot then turn around and immediately lock up the former power holders, let alone hang them from lampposts. So there's a sense of a lack of catharsis, a revolutionary catharsis, a sense of historical injustice that the former power holders are doing so well. Towards the end of his life, Ralf reflected on this, and he said that in addition to what I have often argued, that if you were to do a velvet revolution, a negotiated transition, then at least you should have a truth commission. So there should be some public symbolic confrontation with the difficult past, some line between past and present. Ralph's observation at the end of his life was, we had this holy trinity of the transition, multi-party democracy, free market economy, and civil society, which of course he talked about a lot. He said what we missed was the rule of law, and that actually we should have paid much more attention to the rule of law from the very outset. And it was the lack of the rule of law, the lack of established structures of independent courts that allowed the rapid and corrupt privatization of the nomenklatura. So that's problems of inheritance. Problems of success, very briefly. It seems to me quite clear that if we look at what is happening in Xi Jinping's China or Putin's Russia or Recep Tayyip Erdogan's Turkey, this is to a significant degree a response to, a reaction to, reactionary in the literal sense to the spread of liberalism onto their front garden. So if you take the famous document number 9 of the Chinese Communist Party, it identifies Western constitutionalism, Western multi-party democracy, and Western-style media as existential threats to the future of the Communist Party. If you look at the precise chronology of the evolution of Putin's more authoritarian rule, again you can see it as a response to the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the events of 2011 in big Russian cities. In other words, they felt that the Velvet Revolution, the liberal revolutions were coming onto their front lawn, and so now you have the counter-revolution, the anti-liberal counter-revolution against them, just as you have in Recep Tayyip Erdogan's Turkey. Another example of the problem of success. In the Dahrendorf program at Oxford, we have a big project on what we call Europe Stories, looking particularly at the generation of the post-1989ers. And the problem we have here is that you have a whole generation which has known, unless you lived in former Yugoslavia or Ukraine, really nothing but a Europe that was mainly whole, mainly free, and mainly at peace. And therefore, to some extent, that is taken for granted. Whereas in all earlier generations, you had personal experience of war, dictatorship, fascist or communist, Holocaust or Gulag, to drive the European project. So problems of inheritance, problems of success, problems of anticipation. I think, with hindsight, we should have anticipated much more a revisionist and reactionary backlash from Russia. We should have seen that a country that has one of the largest land empires in European history, accumulated over 3 to 4 centuries, does not lose that empire in the space of just 3 years with barely a shot fired in anger and not have a reaction. And please don't tell me that this was all a reaction to the enlargement of NATO. I met Vladimir Putin in 1994 in St. Petersburg when he was a deputy mayor of St. Petersburg at a Bergedorfer Gesprächskreis. He sat very silent, looking rather sullen for 2 days, and at the end he piped up and he said, "We have to remember that there are some 25 million Russians living outside the territory of the Russian Federation, and we in the Russian Federation have a duty to protect them." That was his version of the duty to protect. And he said there are historic Russian territories that are now outside the Russian Federation, and we have a duty towards them too. And he specifically mentioned Crimea. 1994. So please don't tell me this was all a reaction to mistakes of Western policy through the 1990s. That is something I think we should have anticipated, just as perhaps we should have anticipated the evolution of the Chinese system, which is, ladies and gentlemen, as much a product of 1989 as are the fragile democracies of Central and Eastern Europe. On the 3rd of June 1989, East Central Europe, the European communist world and the Chinese communist world were still basically in the same political space. It was possible to imagine that Chinese communism might have evolved through reform, and it was entirely possible to imagine that in the European communist world you might have had repression, violent repression. On the 4th of June 1989, these two worlds parted company. The very same day you have the semi-free election in Poland, the triumph of Solidarność that leads to the first non-communist prime minister for 40 years, and the Tiananmen Square massacres in China that set China on a completely different path. From that point forward, the two paths completely diverge. What we didn't anticipate was that the Chinese Communist Party, by systematically learning the lessons from the failure of communism in Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, would develop a system which one might call, in drastic shorthand, Leninist capitalism, a system that has given us now, what we didn't have in the 1990s, a major ideological competitor. With that, I turn to the problems of misjudgment. And what I want to argue here, or start by arguing here, is that I think having seen off communism, at least in Europe, we liberals started making some of the fundamental mistakes of communist thinking. Let me mention just three. Our mistake was not to celebrate what happened in 1989 as a great triumph of freedom, democracy, human rights, Europe, and the West. It was all of that. Our mistake was, as the years went by, to believe that this was the new normal, the way things were going, the direction in which history was traveling, so that when it comes to Iraq, some neoconservatives genuinely believed that you had only to topple the dictator and democracy would emerge from underneath as it had in Central Europe. When it comes to the Arab Spring, the Western media reading of the Arab Spring was very much as a kind of second 1989. And of course, that's not at all what happened, because, surprise, we don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know the direction that history is going. That was, of course, the fundamental intellectual mistake of communism, was to believe that there were scientifically discoverable laws of history which told us which direction history is traveling. And in a sense, I think liberals made that mistake. Closely related, I think that liberalism in the 1990s and the 2000s, at least to some extent, became a kind of closed system of thought, an ideology in the pejorative sense of a system of thought which is internally coherent and consistent, but increasingly disconnected with reality. And that was, of course, particularly true of the economics, which Adair Turner, a former Dahrendorf lecturer at Oxford, has brilliantly written about, the twin hypotheses of the rational expectations hypothesis and the perfect markets hypothesis are classic examples of the ideological mistake of a closed system increasingly divorced from reality. Liberal determinism is a contradiction in terms. And what Dahrendorf, along with Karl Popper and Isaiah Berlin and John Stuart Mill, told us again and again was that liberalism is not a system, it is a method, a process. In one of his publications, which I commend to all of you, called The Future Tasks of Liberalism, a report for the Liberal International published in 1988, he says, liberalism is not a utopia, it is not a static system. I quote, liberalism is forever process, the process by which human beings explore new opportunities for more people. So liberalism is about trial and error. It's about experimentation. He very often quoted Popper. It's Popperian falsification in the field of politics and of economics and of social policy. It's a constant free contestation of ideas, which is why free speech is not just a liberal value, it is a liberal value that makes all the other values possible. And Ralf was, of course, a great believer in free speech and debate, which is why the totemic picture of him is, of course, that one up there with Rudi Dutschke on the Volkswagen in Freiburg. The third mistake, which I think liberals made, as it were, analogously with communists, of course, a core thought of Marxism was that being determines consciousness. Well, if you look at the way people thought about transitions to democracy and the stabilization of democracies, I think there was a certain amount of that, of economism. Bill Clinton's "it's the economy, stupid" is a kind of vulgar Marxism with a neoliberal face. It really was the belief that if you get the economics right, that other aspects of society, the superstructure, if you will follow. And by the way, talking of the economics, The Economist, the magazine, is a classic source if you want to trace this fallacy through the 1990s and the 2000s. Now, of course, we also got the economics wrong. That is clearly the case. through a process which Jürgen Kocher has described brilliantly in his History of Capitalism, the process, namely, of what one might call the globalized financialization of capitalism, or you might also say the financialized globalization of capitalism. Both aspects are important. That led us into the financial crisis, 2008-2009, as a financial crisis, larger even than that of 1929, although not in its economic consequences, and to levels of inequality in Britain and the United States not seen for 100 years. So there were big mistakes in the economics themselves, which are familiar to many of us in this room. But the additional point I want to make was that the economism in itself, the reduction of liberalism to the single dimension of economic liberalism, and by the way, in much of post-communist Europe, if you say the word liberalism, people think you mean economic liberalism, free market liberalism. They don't think of social or political or cultural liberalism. That in itself was a mistake. It was a mistake made by the Cameron government in trying to win the Brexit referendum, to believe that you could win it with Project Fear, simply saying it's the economy stupid. Quite wrong, a big mistake. There is, as you know, the discussion, the slightly sterile discussion, about whether cultural or economic factors are more important in explaining the current wave of populism. I think this is a sterile discussion because it's clearly both, and the two intertwined. But the proportions are clearly different in different cases, and the cultural dimension is a really important one in every single case, including those such as Britain and the United States, where the economic inequality measured in both income and wealth, personal wealth, is at its most extreme. The inequality of attention and respect is at least as important as the inequality of income and wealth in explaining the anti-liberal wave of populism. Ronald Dworkin, another great modern liberal thinker, said that for him, the notion of equal respect and concern, I quote, equal respect and concern for all the citizens in a given political community was at the heart of a modern egalitarian liberalism. And we certainly didn't show equal respect and concern for all our people over this period. So in Poland, for example, Maciej Gdula, a distinguished Polish scholar, has shown that it's by no means only the poor and marginalized who support the Law and Justice Party. It's also a new middle class, actually economically getting better, but wanting that equality of attention and respect, which Law and Justice also symbolically gives them. Law and Justice in Poland talks about, it's a very telling phrase, the redistribution of dignity. Not the redistribution of money, the redistribution of dignity. In Britain, a colleague of mine, Anand Menon, whom some of you will know, was speaking, criticizing the economic consequences of Brexit in a northern post-industrial town. And he started talking about GDP. And an elderly working-class woman stood up at the back of the room and said, "Mr. Professor, you talk about GDP. That's your GDP you're talking about, not my GDP." In other words, the very language, the technocratic, economistic language of GDP was already regarded as deeply alienating. And of course, the AfD, I don't need to tell you, this audience, is, in a sense, the best possible example of the importance of the cultural dimension. This is not just one of the richest countries in Europe. This is not just a place where the East German Länder have done in aggregate economically remarkably well. It's a place where, in one opinion poll, 4/5 of AfD voters assessed their personal economic situation as good or very good. And yet they voted AfD. In a recent poll in Saxony, around the latest rather shocking election result, 3/4 of those asked said the economic situation in Saxony is good. 2/3 of those asked said East Germans are treated as second-class citizens. It's not the economy, stupid. And I think this is a really important part of the necessary self-examination and self-criticism of liberals. To sharpen the point slightly, let me put it like this. In the 1990s and 2000s, we in institutions like this, and at Oxford and at LSE and at the Hertie School, quite rightly spent a great deal of our time and attention on the other half of the world. But sometimes I think we did it at the expense of paying attention to the other half of our own societies. And populism is in some ways the revenge of the other half of our own societies. And then to another point on which you have a session here, Bildung als Bürgerrecht, education as civil right. What was the most sort of concrete consequence of Dahrendorf's great initiative in that field along with others? It was, of course, the massive expansion of school leavers going to university, so that in Britain and Germany and elsewhere it's 50% and upward. The unintended consequence of this liberal project, Bildung als Bürgerrecht, was to divide our societies 50-50 between those who'd gone to university, went to live in cities, traveled widely, liked cosmopolitanism, immigration, multiculturalism, open societies, and those who were left behind, having not gone to university, stayed in the smaller towns and the countryside, and resented and felt left behind by all of that. Having higher education was one of the best predictors of how people would vote in the Brexit referendum. Higher education, voted for Remain. No higher education, more likely to vote for Brexit. And another part of that story was the sense captured in repeated attacks on that whipping boy of the populist right, political correctness, that the Overton window of what was sayable in public had been shrunk by a kind of liberal, university-educated metropolitan consensus. And then the populists come along and say things that people in the other half of our societies are actually thinking and saying at home or at the Stammtisch, and that is welcomed. Pierre Asner, the wonderful French thinker on international relations, wrote what is, in my view, the most prescient text on the problems we now face in this regard. It appeared in the magazine Esprit in 1991, and Asner wrote, in celebrating the triumph of liberty and universality post-1989, let us not forget the yearnings and aspirations that have given us socialism on the one hand and nationalism on the other. And then he names the yearnings and aspirations, and he says that for solidarity and equality on the one hand, and for community and identity on the other. And I think that is the most brilliant summary of where we have to go if we're thinking about how we address this problem in a reformed and rejuvenated liberalism. Solidarity and equality, more typically associated with the left, community and identity, more typically associated with the right. So with that, I come in my last few minutes to the question, what is to be done? And here I'm just going to say three quick things and then throw it open for a Dahrendorfian discussion. First of all, I think that we liberals in the broadest sense have to be self-critical fighters. We have to fight against the forces of anti-liberalism, and that's why I'm afraid, as Jutta Almendinger mentioned, I can't stay for the rest of what looks like a wonderful conference, because as you know, we have an election on the 12th of December, and it's actually our last chance to stop Brexit. So I have to go back to fight the good fight to prevent Boris Johnson getting a majority. But self-criticism is absolutely constitutive and essential for liberalism, liberalism as method, liberalism and process. By the way, Jan Werner Müller, in a new book of his called Furcht und Freiheit, reminds us that this centrality of self-criticism is not new, that in 1843, no less, Arnold Rüger published a book entitled Selbstkritik des Liberalismus. So there's nothing new about liberal self-criticism. For me, the fact that in the last 3 years I read at least 20 books on the death of liberalism is the best possible proof that liberalism is still alive. In East Germany and Eastern Europe, in the bookshops, I can tell you in the 1980s, one didn't find any books on the death of communism. And that was both a sure symptom and a cause of the death of communism. So it's a good sign that we are being self-critical and, as it were, beating up on ourselves. But then, of course, we have to come, and this is my second point, to actual constructive proposals, particularly in these two areas of solidarity and equality on the one hand and community and identity on the other. And here I think Dahrendorf helps us at least part of the way. For example, in that wonderful long essay on the future tasks of liberalism, he talks about the need for, I quote, a common floor for all men and women to stand on. And actually, quite radically for that time, his notion of what a common floor would involve included the idea of a basic income guarantee, which he said, and I quote, he said, taking account of all the practical difficulties, he said, I quote, basic income guarantee would clearly come closest to the principles of a liberal social state. And I think that's a message we have to come back to today. In terms of community and identity, for Ralf, as for Isaiah Berlin, not just the notion of belonging, but the feeling of belonging was actually very important indeed. That is why Ralf again and again insisted that the greatest individual liberty to date had been best guaranteed in the framework of the liberal constitutional state-nation. Not the nation-state, but state-nation, État-nation, divided in civic terms. For him, Habermas had Verfassungspatriotismus. Dahrendorf, in a way, had Institutionspatriotismus. For him, institutions, like the university or the LSE, or in the last part of his life, the House of Lords, which he rather mysteriously adored, were sources not just of the separation of powers and the institutional balances necessary for a liberal democracy, but also of the affective and emotional part, the feelings of belonging, of community and identity. And I think that too points a way forward. If I take quickly the example of Poland and what's happening in Poland again, you start from a position where, broadly speaking, the institutions of the state have very little loyalty or affective power because you're in a country where the state has been an alien body for most of the last 200 years. Then you move into a period when they're being built up, but the changes being made in the constitutions and the legal system and so forth is above all seen as what you need to do to return to Europe, right? So those legal and constitutional and institutional changes were presented in some sense as a means to the end of joining the EU. What is now happening, precisely because they're under attack from inside, is that you are beginning to get elements of a kind of constitutional and institutional patriotism. People are beginning to stand up for these institutions because they see the value for them for themselves. hence the wonderful T-shirt that Lech Wałęsa walks about, always wearing under his suit, saying Konstytucja. I actually heard a crowd in Kraków chanting triple separation of powers, which is an unusual demo chant, I have to say. What do we want? Triple separation of powers. When do we want it? Now. But this shows the growth of a certain constitutional and institutional patriotism. But in addition to addressing those problems that we have inherited from the last 30 years, what we also have to do in this fundamental rethinking of liberalism is also to address the challenges that are now coming toward us, the challenges of the next 30 years. So it's no good if we just find remedies for what has gone wrong in the last 30 years. We also have in our solutions to build in answers to the ideological challenge and competition from China, absolutely centrally climate change and what we do about climate change, and the digital revolution, and in particular the next phase of the digital revolution, which is, of course, artificial intelligence, which will revolutionize the world of work, strategic relations, and much else. So that the solutions that we come up with, as we think about solidarity and equality, community and identity, have also to anticipate those larger global challenges coming towards us, and not simply to, as it were, find the answers to yesterday's questions. And my very final point, the process of finding these answers in a reformed and rejuvenated liberalism is not one that's going to happen in the space of a few weeks or a few months. Fine to have new leadership at the SPD. Great maybe to have the Greens in government. But that's not going to do the job. It's a much more fundamental rethinking that is needed, the kind of rethinking that we try to do in institutions like the VZB or the Hertie School or in universities. So if you think of how we came to the post-1945 West European social democratic consensus, for example, if you think about it, first you had Keynes with the general theory, the fundamental rethink. Then in the British context you had Beveridge, that's to say its translation into policy proposals, but not into politics. And then you had Clement Attlee turning it into a manifesto that wins an election. So it's a three-stage process: fundamental rethink, policy, politics. Like it or hate it, what happened with the neoliberal agenda was very similar. First you had Friedman and Hayek. Then you had the work of the Institute for Economic Affairs in London and the American Enterprise Institute and other think tanks in Britain and America that turned it into policy prescriptions. And then you had the politics of Thatcher and Reagan. So what we need to do is, I think, also going to be a three-part process, although hopefully not taking as long as those did. But central to it, at the beginning, is the fundamental rethinking of the challenges of liberalism, the kinds of things. I mean, Ralf, of course, in his life did all three. He did the fundamental rethinking, he did the policy wonkery in think tanks, and he was a politician. But that's very unusual. Essential to it, the starting point for it, in my view, is that deeper, more fundamental rethinking for which we are only at the beginning. So that's what I wanted to lay before you. As I say once again, it's neither systematic nor comprehensive. There's much more to be said about the crisis of liberalism and the answers we might come up with. And for that reason, in the spirit of Dahrendorf, I look forward very much to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your wonderful speech and the final proof that there must be quite a few liberals among us is the liberal approach to our time agenda. Nevertheless, I think the speech is appropriate to discuss what Timothy Garton Ash proposed to us. And we will have a 15 minutes discussion. I'm Wolfgang Merkel, working here at the WZB, and I misuse my position sitting here while you are standing to ask a first provocative question to you, Tim. And the question is, you told us I have to go back to Great Britain to fight, to self-critically fight the Brexit. What are you telling those Brexiteers with lower education? Why should they vote for remaining within the European Union? It is easy to talk to the well-educated people about this issue, but what do you tell them who wanted to leave and who want to leave the European Union?
I tell them that leaving the EU won't solve any of your problems. That you are absolutely right to identify the problems you have identified, some of which I talked about, but Brexit is the solution to none of them, but none of them. And that argument is beginning to have traction because the economic consequences of Brexit, which will of course be worse for precisely the lower educated workers in the post-industrial north of England, the City of London will be fine, are beginning to become apparent. Car manufacturers and others are beginning to say they're not going to invest anymore, or they are disinvesting. And that argument is beginning to have traction. Interestingly enough, what the polling shows us, by the way, the polling shows us that there is now a consistent majority for Remain, a narrow but consistent majority for Remain. And apart from the demographic shift, that's to say some older voters have passed on to another shore and a brighter light, and some younger voters have come onto the electoral rolls who are more pro-European, the biggest shift is in working-class women, interestingly. Working-class women who have begun to see what the consequences are actually going to be for their families and their children. So that actually now the election will be decided by voting in conservative Labour marginal constituencies.
So the floor is open, and please introduce yourself. The first one was Ralf.
Yeah, thank you. It's not up. Hello? How do we turn this on? Okay, yeah, now it is. Yeah, thank you, Tim, for a very inspiring talk. I want to continue a bit along the lines of Wolfgang's question, because you emphasized that in order to get over the crisis of liberalism, liberals will have to rethink the appeals of socialism and nationalism, being solidarity and equality on the one hand, and community and identity on the other. Now, these two, solidarity and equality, have traditionally been only organized within nation states, and nation states are also so far the highest level of human organization on which we have been able to feel meaningful community and identity feelings. So isn't part of the crisis of liberalism since 1989 not also that liberals since the 1990s have been seeking the realization of liberalism very much on the supranational level, and is in that sense a re-evaluation of the appeals of nationalism and socialism, not also doesn't it not also necessitate a re-evaluation of the nation state and maybe also of the advantages of supranationalization? And in that sense, of course, it comes back to the question about Brexit. Not that I think Brexit would be a solution, but at least also those who are for Remain should maybe think about, at least a new kind of Europeanization that provides answers to these challenges?
Ralf Dahrendorf, in the last 10 years of his life, was never a Eurosceptic in the particular British sense, but he was a skeptical European. And that was one of the main reasons that he was a skeptical European. His belief in the value and importance of national liberal and democratic institutions. I think, you have a whole panel on Europe, so I'm not going to try and anticipate that in a short answer. But I don't think it is true to say that there is no solidarity on the European scale. There is not as much as is needed for the particular conditions of the Eurozone. That's a different point. But it is not the case that there is no readiness for a degree of solidarity, because actually the functioning of the European Union also displays mechanisms of cohesion and solidarity, and feelings of solidarity too. So that I think there is a perfectly reasonable balance to be found between the kinds of solidarity and sense of community to be found in what I would prefer to call the state-nation, the liberal democratic state-nation, and those in the European Union. The difficulty is, of course, whether the Eurozone, to function well for Southern Europe, requires more solidarity that is currently available from North Europeans, right? I leave that to the panel. Beyond that, if we're then talking about the issue of immigration, on which all these concerns have fixed, right? Even if the reality of the problem, the causal reality of the problem is not immigration, this is the issue on which the concerns are fixed. I think it seems to me self-evidently the case that while in some theoretical principle one might say that a liberal would want open frontiers, in practice to have open frontiers without controls of immigration would be the beginning of the end of a liberal state and an open society, and very rapidly. If, therefore, we do have to have managed immigration, and by the way, the best example of a genuinely liberal integration of large numbers of immigrants is Canada, and Canada is one of the only advanced Western democracies that actually controls its immigration effectively. So I think there is a real connection between effective management of immigration and effective integration. If that is the case, then the question is posed, what are we to do for all those other people who are going to be stuck on the other side of the Mediterranean in Africa or the wider Middle East? So my corollary to this is much more solidarity in our foreign policy. For example, in our overseas development budget, which in my view should not be 0.7%, it should be 1.5%.
So we have time for 2 more questions. We are already 22 minutes over time, and I saw the lady to the right, and then the gentleman on the left.
Thank you. Eva Atanas of Bard College, Berlin. Well, I had 2 questions, but I'll exercise self-restraint and limit it to one. In your diagnosis of what produced the crisis, when you talked about liberal errors, I was wondering whether we could add another one to those. I mean, you commend liberalism for its self-criticism, or you recommend self-criticism to liberalism, but as all the classic liberals have pointed out, it's very difficult to be self-critical if yours is the only opinion. So you need you need an interlocutor. So I'm wondering whether part of the error is precisely not liberalism or liberal Western states in sort of efforts in all these years to remake the world in their own image, sort of eliminate alternatives to liberalism on a global scale. And so if that could be recognized as an error, couldn't we say that what we see now today with the reemergence of competitors actually is a good thing for liberalism? It's a good thing for the world. It's good to have alternatives, because then liberalism could stand for itself.
Tim, can we collect the 2 questions and then you can respond? No, it was, sorry, it was the gentleman 2 rows ahead.
Thank you for the talk. So you mentioned that in Poland, in particular, there is a demand not just on the part of the middle class, not just for a redistribution of wealth, but a redistribution of dignity. So for a redistribution of wealth, it's very easy for, I think, all of us to imagine what that looks like on a policy level. Can you think of any successful examples of redistribution of dignity in the modern age, of what that policy looks like, whether as a specific something's already happened or a specific proposal for a kind of policy that would accomplish that goal?
Right. Thanks very much. I'll be quick as I can. If you read the New York Times or the Guardian or Le Monde or probably the Süddeutsche in the years before the crisis, you would not have found many reports written with insight and imaginative sympathy about the left-behind parts of our own societies, about the Rust Belt or the post-industrial north of England or the neglected southeast of Poland. So I think media have an important part to play in this, in actually writing, and then after the crisis, you had the journalistic safari of the liberal metropolitan journalist bravely going to somewhere like Durham, to the north of England, or to the Rust Belt to discover these exotic parts of your own country. So I think media have an important part to play in representation in the double sense. Representation is also recognition. The other thing I really do think, and this is maybe a subject for your panel on education, is the prestige, the standing, the respect that is given to the half of our societies that have technical education or other kinds of training, apprenticeships, and not just going to university. That's something in Britain, we dramatically neglected that. And so those will be two small examples of things that could be done. Now, on the first question, I absolutely agree with you. Konkurrenz belebt das Geschäft, one says in German. And now we have what we didn't have in the 1990s, which is major ideological competition. We have to recognize that the Chinese model of authoritarian capitalism, seen from Latin America or Africa, is a major ideological competitor. And I think it's good for us. It keeps us on our toes. I think what happened after winning, quote unquote, the Cold War is that we became complacent and self-satisfied and hubristic. So I think the competition is good. And I agree with you on that. And I think also, and this is going to be possibly controversial, but I think also that we need to have more of that competition in our own universities and our own intellectual debates. I think we have too much narrowed the Overton window, in which the range of views allowed for a civilized debate in a university or a think tank becomes almost liberalism only for the liberals, right? And so I actually think there is a challenge for us to take in more radical points of view, both from the left and from the right, and maybe from other directions of the compass that we haven't heard of, than we have so far. And I think that would be, that would be a very good thing for us all to do, and I hope you will do it over the next 2 days.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Great pleasure. Thank you.